Okay, we're going to pick up on page 530. There's a cute little picture of the mountaintop removal. This is really just a horrible process in itself. It's really popular in places like West Virginia and the Appalachian Mountains. And this is how we literally remove mountains to mine for coal. And we'll talk more about mountaintop removal in chapter 22, and you'll watch a documentary called The Last Mountain about a mountain in West Virginia. But again, just make sure you know that mountaintop removal for coal is horrible for the environment. They talk about primary versus secondary extraction. Just make sure you read over this little paragraph here and know the difference between them. Now, fracking. We started fracking originally for oil, but now in the US, we predominantly use it for natural gas. Many farmers in like Pennsylvania, Ohio, they've actually given the rights to their land to natural gas companies, and they literally build these towers here, and they actually drill or frack or conduct fracking on their property. There is a great documentary. It's called Gasland, and it shows you like what exactly the process looks like and how the people's land and farms have been impacted due to the fracking process. Now, as I said, fracturing technique or fracking. This is when you pump water, sand, and other chemicals into rocks, and you try to crack them to extract the natural gas that's trapped inside the rocks. However, oftentimes the gas gets into our well water, which is our aquifers, and there have been cases, and again, in that documentary I talked about Gasland, you can actually see people lighting their water coming out of their faucets on fire because there's so much natural gas trapped in their well water. So it's kind of scary. Chemicals such as benzene contaminate the water. Since fracking has started, places like Oklahoma that's never experienced earthquakes now have earthquakes because of all of this drilling. Methane can leak into the air. It's a greenhouse gas, so we can actually add additional greenhouse gases than necessary. And fracking can cause habitat fragmentation with all the roads to the drill sites. And the other big thing is, what do we do with all this wastewater? Where should we send it? How can we treat it? Right now, a lot of times it's just being dumped places. So these are all questions we have to talk about with this fracking technique that has become very popular in the United States. Okay. All right, coal mining. Coal mining destroys habitats, causes soil erosion. Acid drainage can occur, which is when chemical runoff of sulfide specifically. Again, we have mountaintop removal. And the reason why mountaintop removal is so bad is actually causes the clogging of streams and rivers with debris, which is called overburden. So this is how we also pollute our surface waters. Subsurface mining causes the black lung disease. We don't do subsurface mining that much anymore. This is like the old school coal mining that they talk about in a lot of old movies, just because of the health risks related to that, where men would literally be mining for 12-hour shifts inside of a cave. New Jersey actually had a lot of this subsurface mining historically in the Northwest area. Now, all of these external costs are not factored into the cost of coal, and this is why coal is so cheap compared to the other fossil fuels. We don't take into account all of these negatives. Some people want it to, because then it will create more money for the coal industry, but for now, it has not been pushed. Okay, oil extraction also alters the environment. Again, as we've talked before, roads to drilling sites causes fragmentation. Also, building all the homes for all those who are working at the drilling locations. We have to install pipelines. That's how we get all this oil that we're drilling from one place to another, so we're destroying habitats that way. And last but not least, where do we put all the waste? So we have all these waste piles that are contaminating possibly the ground, the soil, and eventually groundwater. Okay. The next couple of pages talks all about different type of spills and leaks related to fossil fuel transport. And the three big ones that we've actually talked about that you need to make sure you review again is your Deepwater Horizon, which was in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the most recent one. And the Exxon Valdez, which happened in Alaska. So just make sure that you review the impacts of oil spills on the environment. So as you can see here, between the cleanups of beaches, how it affects the wildlife, the fire, and so forth. Okay. This case study here talks a lot specifically about the Deep Horizon, or the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico. So it shows you basically the one well where it blew out and the whole area that was affected by this and so forth. So it's a pretty interesting little diagram there. And then this also just explains. So just make sure you read through this. Okay. Clean coal technologies. So clean coal is a term that the coal industry likes to use to make them feel better and say that, oh, the coal isn't always that bad. Basically, we can use wet scrubbers and electrostatic precipitators on smokestacks. We learned about this when we talked about air pollution. Another process is gasification of coal. They claim that this is less harmful. It's not widely practiced. We can also do CO2, carbon dioxide capture or carbon capture, and deposit it underground. Now, this process is very experimental, and they're having issues of figuring out how can they do this where they can actually take the CO2 and put it back underground without causing earthquakes. So make sure that you just review this image here, where it talks about how they try to capture all of the CO2 and the carbon and somehow put it back underground where it originally came from. Okay, a few other things. They talk about OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These specifically are more in the Middle East, and they have basically resolved to stop selling oil to the United States. These, again, are mostly of your Arab countries, as you can see here. So they basically had a big issue with us in the 70s, and that's when oil prices skyrocketed because of this. So just make sure you review this. Okay. All right, energy conservation. So a big topic on past FRQs is all about how can we conserve energy, not what are alternative energies. So basically we have to figure out how to reduce energy in order to extend the supply that we know is limited. We don't have it's a non-renewable resource, all of our fossil fuels. So CAFE standards, which we'll talk more in a second. You can also buy a car with a high mile per gallon rate. Most cars now are in the mid 30s, but certain places like California require cars to be closer to the mid 50s. So the higher your mile per gallon is, the more efficient your car is, meaning the less gasoline you would need to use. Other big thing is to insulate our buildings to prevent loss of heat or AC. This includes like your insulation in the walls, but more energy efficient insulated windows. So this can actually lower your heating and cooling bills in your home. So eventually would save you money. To buy Energy Star appliances, and then lighting choices. So using fluorescent or LED light bulbs instead of your traditional incandescent light bulbs. Another term you need to know is cogeneration, and this is where you take heat produced from one process and use it to generate energy at another. So we talk a little bit about this, where they can capture heat generated and use it in nearby workplaces or homes to produce other types of energy, so nothing is wasted. Okay. CAFE standards. Now, these are if you look here, it's the corporate average fuel efficiency standards. And this is the minimum mile per gallon a fleet of cars per company can have. And this basically promotes fuel economy, and it lessens air pollution and greenhouse gases. So if you look at this diagram down here, it shows you how automotive companies have reacted and responded to public policy. So as you can see, cars and trucks, and then just trucks below. Okay. Now, something your textbook doesn't really talk about is baseline power. So we're going to go over this. And baseline power is basically the minimum power needed in a system at all times. So for the most part is every time you turn on a switch or you plug something in, you don't have to wait for energy. It's already there. All right. Imagine if you had to wait for the energy to get from the power plant to your house every time you wanted to use it. And coal, nuclear, and hydro are all good for this, where that you can have basically ready, available, on-demand energy at all times. About half of the electricity is lost between a power plant and a home. And a way that you can prevent this is by using updated smart power grids. And you can save a lot of energy as well as reduce your amount of greenhouse gases produced. Question is, why don't we do this? Money. The costs to create these smart power grids would basically fall upon the taxpayer. And a lot of people never vote for it because they don't want their taxes to go up. However, over time, this would actually save the public money if they invested in a smart power grid, because then eventually their energy bills would decrease extremely over time. Okay. And the last thing we're going to talk about is how governments can promote energy conservation. They can do tax breaks or rebates for energy efficient appliances, allow hybrid cars to drive in carpool lanes when there's a single driver, again, the CAFE standards, and also subsidize alternative energy sources like wind, solar, etc. That's it for chapter 19.